Hey, what's going on, y'all? My name is Nick. Welcome back to our Let's Read of The Sympathizer. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 8, the start of the Hamlet saga, is kind of how I would frame this chapter in, I guess, the most broadest of terms. This chapter is not super long, but we get a lot of really good stuff in this one. A lot of, like I said, setting up for the next kind of set of chapters that we'll be getting into. So we'll do this one how we do it every single time so far. We'll do a really broad stroke summary to kind of get the main ideas of the idea out there, and then we'll do a little play-by-play, and then at the end we'll talk a little bit more deeply about one of the scenes, which I think was just a little bit more important than the rest of it. So without further ado, here is my broad stroke summary for The Sympathizer, Chapter 8. So the Sympathizer meets with the auteur to discuss the inaccuracies of the Hamlet. The Madame makes pho, and the general outlines his plot to begin the reclamation of Vietnam from the communists. So like I said, not a super long chapter, but pretty impactful. You know, all the situations are kind of happening in the two main locations. We're at the auteur's house in Hollywood Hills, and then we're at the general's house in the Hollywood Flatlands. And so, you know, it's just a lot of the Sympathizer kind of having conversations in this one, which you got to slow down every once in a while. Last chapter kind of felt like frenetic, you know, it feels like you're kind of moving through these different places, moving through time. You know, it's kind of difficult to follow in some capacity, but this one slows down a little bit and really gets to kind of the meat and potatoes of things. So now we'll get into the kind of play-by-play summary, highlighting different things as they kind of come up throughout the retelling. So the chapter starts with a brief excerpt from the Hamlet, which is just an over-the-top, violent, you know, exploitative story of the American soldiers protecting an innocent village on the border of Laos. The main villain of the story is just simply named King Kong. I think that's hilarious. The man that has killed many and stocked his jungle full of men and women that have killed more. The only thing that can save the Hamlet is the intervention of the Green Berets, the A-Team, as the Sympathizer says. The white saviors that the destitute villagers need. The film is insane, obviously. It's kind of, I think, designed to be a parody of the real movies that get made about this time period, especially so soon after the events of the war. You know, it's all still so fresh in the people's minds that I think that this is kind of designed to be like an insane, hilarious representation of, you know, the more grim reality that the Sympathizer has talked about and lived through. The Sympathizer receives the screenplay and is then greeted at the director's home by his assistant Violet, who is the worst kind of bureaucrat, the Sympathizer says. He says the aspiring one, which I think is a funny turn of phrase. He's still kind of coming down from the emotional turmoil of the Major's assassination. You know, he's still dealing with seeing his head on the table at the wedding party. He even says as much in the beginning of this chapter. And so then he meets with the auteur, the director of the film, who's referred to exclusively as the auteur. I think that that's something that I really liked about this book. The main characters are not really given names. They're kind of just the general, the madame. You know, Claude, I guess, is a name, but it's kind of more... I think it's the implication that it's a little bit more of a code name. You know, he works for the State Department. He's kind of he's involved in clandestine operations all the time. So I think, the Claude, the Sympathizer, you know, we haven't even gotten his name. He talks about how his name is misspelled on the front of the manila envelope that he receives with the script in it. So, you know, he references it, but he kind of dances around it, you know. The commandant of the prison as well. Yeah, I like how kind of everyone is unnamed, and they're left to exclusively their roles in the story. I think that's a cool feature of this book. He goes to the director's house and he has a ton of notes. The Sympathizer does. He's got a ton of notes. Spends a bunch of time working on reading the script, writing notes in the margin. There's a particularly important passage. It's a little bit longer, but I'm intending to read it word for word just so we can kind of see how he's feeling about the situation, really get to the meat of his emotions regarding the situation. We'll get into that in a few minutes. He starts off by saying that, it's... Well, he starts off by thinking that, for a film set in Vietnam, it's funny that there's no intelligible speech by any person of Vietnamese descent in the movie. All the real talking is done by the Green Berets or King Kong, or it's exclusively taken out of the hands of the people, which is pretty indicative of the feelings about the people that the story is being taken from. So I think the Sympathizer kind of goes into it thinking that this is something that I can really help with and make turn something shitty into something positive. So that's unfortunately how he keys himself up before he goes in to speak with the auteur. So we get a short introduction to the auteur. He's a Greek-born director who created some great films, which is what the Sympathizer says. One of them is about a Greek-born hoodlum in the streets of Detroit, and then the other one is about the death of the American dream in Venice Beach. The Sympathizer, I think by the end of this chapter, as much as it pains him to say, he does think highly of the auteur. There's a reason why he calls him an auteur. It's generally saved for people with pretty good work. So I think that he's unfortunately showing a little bit of respect to the director, even though he's kind of a bad guy. He's completely unable to write a compelling story about the Vietnam War, though. That's important to note right off the top. So before anything, the auteur kind of goes into a diatribe about Hollywood and about, the importance of films and culture, talking about the congressman, the Green Beret who vetted the script, the stomach-churning Polaroids that the Green Beret showed to the auteur while they were doing the vetting process. So he kind of explodes on the Sympathizer and asks a question at the end of his monologue, and the Sympathizer takes a second and he's like, oh gosh, I think this guy's actually talking to me. So he's kind of left reeling from this monologue, and somewhere in there he was asked a question. He's trying to kind of flounder for a response. For the first time in a while, I think the Sympathizer feels like a foreigner, which is, he says as much. He feels out of place in this place. That's incredibly rare for him at this time. He's got kind of a good thing going with Sophia. He's got a job. He's got a social security card. Like he's an American for all intents and purposes. And so in this setting, I think that he's experiencing a bit of a cultural alienation, which kind of flusters him. He's self-conscious, he's vulnerable, and then he starts to kind of tear apart the auteur's screenplay. He comments on the inaccuracies of Vietnamese life and culture, the fact that he doesn't seem like he was even really trying to get anything correct about Vietnamese people or Vietnam in general, especially at this incredibly important time in the history of the country. The auteur is kind of not very nice, and I think the Sympathizer is standing up for himself a little bit in whatever way he thinks that he's capable of doing so. He's a prideful guy at the end of the day, and I think that he's just sticking up for himself a little bit. But this obviously doesn't go over very well at all. The auteur gets defensive, claims that the Sympathizer doesn't really know his ass from his elbow, essentially, citing the fact that he's never really made a film before, so he doesn't really know what he's talking about, which, is fair, but it's they're speaking two different languages almost at this point. You know, they're having different cultural conversations. They're having different conversations, really. You know, the auteur is talking about making a movie, and the sympathizer is talking about making an accurate movie. Which, you know, those two camps, they can't really coexist. You know, it's kind of outside the auteur's scope of capability at this point. He's just trying to make something that's going to be popular. And the sympathizer is thinking that, you know, the people really want to see this video or this movie that paints them in a not so great light, you know, because that's really what you have to do in order to tell the story accurately. So there's a bit of a disconnect between the two. Their wires get a little bit crossed in this conversation. The most important offensive, really, that the sympathizer launches into is about the screams used by the auteur in his script, citing the fact that it's not really what people in his country scream like, which is what he says. He says that they're unrealistic. Not only are the fact that, you know, people aren't calling for the police because the police are usually the ones that are doing the harming. The screams themselves, when phonetically written down, are not accurate. So he kind of gets in his face a little bit and borrows his pen and writes down how the screams should be. But the reason that he's thinking about this, and the reason that he feels as though he's got firsthand experience of this process, is he thinks back to an episode from his time as a lieutenant when a Montagnard is strangled by a superior officer in front of him. He remembers this scream, and it plays in his head during that exchange with the auteur, and he writes down this scream phonetically for the auteur, which I'm not going to obviously do, but yeah, it's a lot different than the way that the auteur said it was, way it should be. So that's kind of where that whole episode ends. You know, we're left with a ... Following that exchange, and we pick back up with the sympathizer as he's heading down the hills to go meet the general and the madame. He thinks back about some final words of wisdom that the director has for him, basically telling him to get the hell out of his house, and, you know, the fact that he tries to bring up cultural insensitivity, and the director just simply dismisses him, tells him to get the hell out. So, tail between his legs, the sympathizer heads down and sees the general and the madame. The madame had made pho. After he's done kind of retelling the story to the general and the madame, her method of making him feel better is offering him a bowl of pho. So this episode kind of brings him back, sense memories him back to when he was living with his mom, his jobs when it was time to make pho, cooking the garlic and ginger, as well as skimming the fat off the top of the broth. So this kind of brings him back, recenters himself a little bit to a time that, there wasn't quite so much to worry about. And this is really where the segment is that I wanted to kind of read word for word. It's a super important segment, a super important passage. It is a little bit long, so bear with me. There might be some stopping and starting here, but it's worth it. I promise. Trust me. This is the sympathizer reflecting on his inability to get to the auteur. He says, "How could I be so dense? How could I be so deluded? Ever the industrious student, I had read the screenplay in a few hours and then reread and written notes for several more hours, all under the misguided idea that my work mattered. I naively believed that I could divert the Hollywood organism from its goal, the simultaneous lobotomization and pickpocketing of the world's audiences. The ancillary benefit was strip mining history, leaving the real history in the tunnels along with the dead, doling out tiny sparkling diamonds for audiences to gasp over. Hollywood did not just make horror movie monsters, it was its own horror movie monster, smashing me under its foot. I had failed, and the auteur would make the Hamlet as he intended, with my countrymen serving merely as raw material for an epic about white men saving good yellow people from bad yellow people. I pitied the French for their naivety in believing they had to visit a country in order to exploit it. Hollywood was much more efficient, imagining the countries it wanted to exploit. I was maddened by my helplessness before the auteur's imagination and machinations. His arrogance marked something new in the world, for this was the first war where the losers would write history instead of the victors, courtesy of the most efficient propaganda machine ever created. With all due respect to Joseph Goebbels and the Nazis, who never achieved global domination. Hollywood's high priests understood innately the observation of Milton's Satan, that it was better to rule in hell than serve in heaven, better to be a villain, loser, or anti-hero than virtuous extra, so long as one commanded the bright lights of center stage. In this forthcoming Hollywood trompe l'oeil, all the Vietnamese of any side would come out poorly, herded into the roles of the poor, the innocent, the evil, or the corrupt. Our fate was not to be merely mute, we were to be struck dumb. And at this point, the Madame offers him the pho to help kind of bring him back to life. But I think that passage really describes everything that we've kind of talked about in the beginning here about the way that the sympathizer is feeling about the auteur, about the white savior mechanic, about history being written by the loser for the first time rather than the winner. Obviously, he's not happy. He's really not happy about this. And that segment, I think, is probably the most important, not only from a story perspective, for making the sympathizer, for giving him a little bit more of a push away from the West. I think it's important from a historical perspective, understanding the way that the kind of movie industrial complex, the film industrial complex, as well as other modern forms of media, were able to tell the story differently than it really went. And not until recently, within the last 20 or 30 years, I think, have, with the advent of social media and the ability for everyone to kind of tell a story, for everyone to tell their story, I think that kind of helps to alleviate a lot of these problems that the sympathizer is talking about. Whereas before, you had to kind of rely on these big mass media giants to tell any story. Now we have the ability to log on to a browser and find anyone's story from anywhere in the world. So it really helps to kind of alleviate some of these pressures that the sympathizer is talking about in this segment. Like I said, the Madame offers him some pho. He talks about the sense memories at this point. He even says that the Madame should open a restaurant, which I think is pretty funny and cute. But after this is when the general kind of outlines his plot, and the sympathizer kind of gets brought into the fold to see as far as the plan is so far. And that's actually going to be the topic of our deep dive today. So that was primarily, that was 3/4 of chapter 8. And we will get into the last quarter and the plan to reclaim Vietnam right now. So the segment starts with the general kind of steering the conversation away from the soup and towards Sonny's coverage of the Major's funeral and the wedding party. Sonny reports on the potential for the Major's deaths to have some sort of political implications, and the speeches at the wedding party centering on the war. He asks in his column, isn't it time that we stopped talking about the war? Isn't the war over? And the general is unhappy, to say the absolute least. He states the responsibilities of reporters is to report facts, not put ideas into people's heads or to interpret the facts. It's just their job to say it like it is. The sympathizer in this segment is still kind of reeling from the meeting with the auteur mixed with the soup. He's in kind of a freaky headspace, and he kind of doesn't talk back, but he doesn't play the role quite how he should be, and he's quickly reprimanded by the Madame. She asks what side he's on, and I'd like to imagine the Sympathizer kind of shitting a brick at this point. You know, reporters report facts, editors ensure the facts get told, and editors are controlled through beatings, which is what the Madame has to say about why Sonny should be reporting in a specific way. The problem with Sonny, says the Madame, is that he doesn't have an editor to keep him in check, because he is the editor of his own newspaper. The Sympathizer, remembering the role as the good captain, immediately concedes, totally folds, agrees with their, obviously he's got to kind of keep up appearances here, so he immediately folds. He falls back into the motions so quickly that he's reminded of dreams that he has about him trying to pull a mask off of his face, but his face is, the mask is just his face. We're getting back to the neat through line of the Man of Two Faces, the duality of his personalities and all of this kind of stuff. So this is just another example of that, and I think that it kind of snaps into him when the Madame asks what side he's on. That's a kind of direct question for a spy to be answering, and I think it kind of freaks him out a little bit. The Sympathizer then comments on the fact that if the public is unable to sift through the noise, it's difficult because there's too much opinion floating around. He's kind of conceding to the general and the Madame and agreeing with them, remembering his place in the hierarchy and remembering his place in the world at this point. He's not at home, he's not with Mon, he's with, he's spying right now. He's a spy, and he's kind of reminded of that pretty quickly here. The general then comments about the pitfalls of too many opinions. He says, look at the voting system. Even two choices may be one too many. One choice is enough, and no choice might be even better. So I think that we're starting to kind of see the cracks of the general show up a little bit more. He's been living in exile for a year. He's kind of had to run off with his tail between his legs in order to save himself. He's dishonored, and he's embarrassed, and he's kind of flailing at this point. He went from being a general in the army to owning a liquor store. So he's angry. He's radicalizing himself because of his vindictiveness. He's pissed, and he wants justice. And justice for him is putting the people that he supports back in power and squashing any chance of anyone else having a say in that matter. The general then asks the Sympathizer to talk to Sonny about how things were done in the good old days, and this then gets us into the plan to reclaim Vietnam, pretty much. The conversation then turns to the progress of the plan. The general says that there is some support in Claude and the congressman, obviously, but the American people aren't really ready to fight another war, especially after losing the last one, especially in Vietnam. So the project is kind of, it's slow going. It's a slow burn, as they say. The general has a list of officers that are prepared to meet to discuss the project. They're all ready to fight and reclaim their honor as well as their country. So the kind of theoretical needs for the project get outlined here a little bit, employing certain communist strategies like developing a vanguard, developing and implementing front organizations, like a women's group, a youth group, an intellectuals group, Sonny's newspaper, creation and deployment of cells to ensure that if one cell is lost, then the others may continue, the creation of overland infiltration routes through Thailand, the securing of funds in order to gather men and supplies and places to train. So it's kind of slow going here. It's in the very early stages of getting itself off the ground, but this is all very important information for the Sympathizer to be receiving, so he's able to then transmit that back to his communist handlers. So I can imagine that over the next few chapters, it's going to kind of get a little bit Harry, the sympathizer is probably going to be asked to do some things by his communist handlers that he finds difficult to deal with, as well as from the general. The general and Claude are probably going to ask him to do some things that he might not want to do either. So he's going to be kind of caught between a rock and a hard place here. And this scene right here is really important for kind of setting up that next set of events that the sympathizer is going to have to kind of work himself through. The general kind of concludes by saying that they got to kind of operate how the communists did. They got to operate underground. They need to be thinking in the long game. They can't just be pushing in to fight right now. They don't have the strength. They don't have the numbers. They don't have the ability really to fight a head-on battle. They're sowing right now, and then later on they'll come and reap. The project must continue to remind the people, though, that they should be resentful of the fact that they lost their country and the fact that they had to flee and become refugees in America. And the general says that they shouldn't get complacent. He talks about how they got to stay mad, because if they don't stay mad, then they're not really gonna want to go fight when the time to fight comes. He finishes by saying, "Always resent, never relent," which they agree has some ring to it as a new slogan for the project. I think that more so than anything, this segment kind of acts as a staging ground for the next segment of the book. Like I was saying the last time, the last chapter was kind of an exhale chapter to get the broad strokes picture of the next set of chapters. The introduction of the Hamlet plot, the introduction of the congressman, all of these kinds of things are helping to kind of swell the action, populate the story with avenues with which to go down. And this chapter, I think, is another, it's just tiptoeing down a few of those different ends that we're going to be able to interact with more deeply as the story progresses. I think as much as the Hamlet story is going to force the sympathizer to reconcile with his past, I think that the project story and the general trying to reclaim Vietnam is going to force him to confront his future. He's kind of caught between two worlds. He's got his life in America with the general and with Sophia and with Bowen and all of these people. He's got so much going on, but at the same time, he's still a communist spy. He's supposed to go back to Vietnam at some point to live. Who knows when and if that will happen. But I think also it's important to see the early signs of mental deterioration in the general. Expressing authoritarian ideas, attempting to re-engage in armed conflict. I think that it's important to kind of see that he's losing it a little bit, and take note of that, because I think it's going to be important as time goes on. He's probably going to start to ask for some pretty insane stuff that this chapter, I think, is a really good indicator of what's to come in the future for the general. Okay, so that's it. That's chapter 8. It was a pretty quick hit. The most important things from this chapter are kind of getting into the Hamlet storyline, as well as the plan to reclaim Vietnam storyline. We're just getting into these storylines, and it's going to be exciting to see the progression of things, for the sympathizer, for the general, for everybody. Let me know what you thought about this chapter. If I missed something that you keyed in on, please let me know. If you got any suggestions, let me know. But other than that, thanks for watching, as always, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.